Hey there, music makers. I'm Hayes Griffin, and welcome to Mandolin Secrets Live, a bi-weekly show where we take a deeper look at what's happening in the world of mandolin secrets. This week, we are deviating from the standard episode format to bring you another episode in the Mindful Music Maker series. I'm joined by my new friend and mindfulness mentor, Lama Adam Berner. Adam has a BA in music from Otterbein University and was a musician and private music teacher for much of his life. After he took refuge at Columbus KTC in 2009, he volunteered as chant leader, member at large, and communications coordinator. Lama Adam returned home to Columbus KTC this past year in June to serve as an associate resident teacher. And today we're going to kind of be talking about some like mindfulness music practices, how to find your authentic musical self, and playing through your mistakes. So I'm really excited to have Adam on board with us. Before we dive into this week's discussion, though, be sure to head to mandolinsecrets.com/live to sign up for reminders about our upcoming streams. And if you can't tune in live, never fear. Just search Mandolin Secrets Live on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe to get updates when we release a new episode. Also, I want to mention we've got a really big kind of launch coming up at the end of the month that hasn't officially been announced yet, but I want to let my Mandolin Secrets Live folks in on the secret. We're going to be launching, doing the full public launch of the Mandolin Secrets Guitar Club. So if you're a guitar player out there or play a little bit of guitar and want to continue your journey, head to mandolinsecrets.com/guitar and sign up on our wait list to get notifications about the full release of the Guitar Club and some more information on what we're going to be doing there. All right, let's stop talking about the Mandolin Secret stuff and bring in my buddy Adam. Adam, how you doing, my friend?
Hi, how are you, Hayes?
I am great, man. It's so good to have you with us here on the stream today. I got to say that our conversation the other day was extremely stimulating, and I'm excited to kind of share some of your teachings and insights in the realm of music and mindfulness with the listeners out there. I know that everyone's going to get a lot out of today's discussion. Before we kind of like dive into a lot of that stuff, though, would you mind kind of filling us in on your bio a little more? I know I kind of hit the highlights in there, right? But your musical and mindfulness journey is a little more complex than what I was able to give there. So fill us in on who you are and what you've been up to for the last decade and a half.
Yeah. Well, I think that the most recent interesting thing is that I did this 3-year retreat. So I was isolated from 2016. Summer of 2016 until the retreat ended and was scheduled to end on March 9th of last year. So literally I came out right in time for the pandemic. And so there's a lot of catching up to do. I'm still catching up. And then before that, I think you covered it in the bio. I was a musician for many years and found meditation. And actually, I think something I didn't mention to you the other day, but right before I was in the retreat, I was actually a wholesaler for a business that like supplies head shops. So I was like wholesaling that kind of gear all across the country and the world. And then I became a Buddhist monastic for 3 years. And now I'm kind of trying to figure out how to, put all these things together, kind of like we all are. Like, who are we? How do we be who we want to be and also fit what we need to do? And so that's kind of where I'm at right now.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, that's interesting to hear the wholesale aspect of things too. I always love, isn't that something crazy about being a musician too? All of us always have like other jobs, you know what I mean? Than like just playing the bars until 2 a.m. or whatever. So that's interesting.
Yeah,
I'm glad you threw that tidbit in there.
Keeps it interesting.
Exactly, right? Exactly. So the other day we kind of, and just for the listeners out there, I guess before we dive into the main topic, I found Adam through Columbus KTC, which is kind of like the Buddhist center here in Columbus, Ohio, and he gave a really good Dharma talk a couple weeks ago on kind of was it like a maintaining like mindfulness through the workday, right? And a lot of what he said in that talk resonated with me. So I kind of reached out and was like, hey, dude, we do this podcast. I think people would be really interested to hear some of this stuff. And that led us to this topic of kind of like playing through your mistakes and kind of finding your authentic musical self, through mindfulness practices, what would you what do I want to say? How would you start that conversation with someone who asked you that question, I guess? Like, how do I play through my mistakes and get on the path to finding my authentic musical self? Like, what are some teachings that you've learned over the years to kind of help us out with that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that the first topic is mindfulness, because what that really means is knowing what you should be doing. So if you're gonna have mistakes, and we all are, I'm sure people who've been playing for a couple months and people who've been playing for many, many years, like, you're always catching mistakes no matter where you are. It's kind of just a matter of how quickly you're catching them. Are you noticing them, long after you've made them, or as you're making them, or are you noticing it when you're about to make it and you're able to stop it before it actually comes out, and in any case, your radar is kind of always up for these mistakes, and your radar is activated for divergences from what you should be doing, because you're aware of what you should be doing. And so that's one way I think of thinking about music and mindfulness, because I'm sure we'll get into that today too. But the practice of mindfulness, the doing meditation in particular, you're actually just placing your attention in one place. But there's very little opportunity to do just that only when you're out moving around through the world or playing in a gig. So why would we do that? Like, part of the reason why we cultivate the ability to just put our attention in one place is so that we can know when we're not doing that, and those two things arise together. So it's kind of like some mindfulness and some awareness. And because of the mindfulness, we're able to cultivate some awareness, the awareness being the kind of expansive, open element that sees when we are making a mistake or we are away from what we want to be doing. So I think the reason I thought this would be a good topic is because no matter how careful you are, you will always notice your mistakes, and you'll notice them more the more tuned your awareness becomes, and you'll notice them more frequently. So it's kind of ironic in a way that, like, the better you get, the more you notice your imperfections,
Yeah. So in terms of getting better at noticing, for say I'm a musician who I've heard this term mindfulness, and I kind of have a general understanding of what you're talking about here. It's like, okay, if I can hone in on just focusing on one thing, then that's going to make me more aware of things in the moment. How do I go about practicing that in my daily life? If I'm very unfamiliar with this.
Yeah. So the short instruction for the practice of shamatha in our tradition is basically just to put your attention on your breath, and then notice when it's diverged from that. Notice when you've become distracted by thoughts. And I think that we tend to notice our mistakes usually, or states in which we're not being as careful as we should be, when we're thinking about something that's other than what we're playing. That's kind of the most obvious one. And the analog for that in a session of meditation is usually something to do with the three times, those being like present, future, and past. Like if we realize we're thinking about something that happened before, that's clearly we're not here, and if we're thinking about something that's might happen or worried about what's going to happen, like, how funny is it that, like, we'll mess up because we're thinking about maybe making a mistake in the next bar.
Man,
that stuff happens.
You're talking about my kryptonite right there. I would say, if there's like one single thing that will lead to my mistakes, it's like me thinking about the potential for making a mistake in the future.
Yeah, so crazy. And that leads actually really well to that third. So we talked about past and future, but so the present is another one, because when you actually start trying to think about the present, you're really thinking about what, like, just happened a second ago, or maybe like what's about to maybe potentially happen. So it's still, you're not actually like in the present, even when you're thinking about the present. And so that's like, I always joke when I teach meditation, like, part of like knowing you're distracted, or one way you can know you're distracted, is thinking like, yeah, I've got this, I'm doing it. and that's distraction, like you're no
Like
longer
you are
just
not
with
doing
the
it.
experience. Yeah.
That's so funny, man.
Exactly.
Well, and it's like this is one of those things where like, we're about to like dive down the rabbit hole real deep right now. It's like, how do you at what, because I see that as kind of like a bubble almost, like or like some kind of curve. You're talking about the three kind of times, past, present, future. Like, what is the best space to occupy when you're playing music on that kind of spectrum? You know what I mean? Like where is it most productive to hone in on that kind of scale? You know what I mean? So that we don't make mistakes and all that kind of stuff. That's maybe more of a rhetorical question than one that you can answer, but if you have an answer, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that's where, Hayes and I started talking the other day about this idea, because to be honest, like he's been thinking about mindful music making before I was, because I know that my mindfulness practice has helped my playing, and it benefits it, but I never really thought about like, is playing mindful, or, how do these two things relate? And I think we're still figuring this out, because part of it, one thing I said the other day is that I think that when we play music, there's so much we're putting our attention on. Like it's almost impossible to just put your attention on one thing. I mean, not almost, it literally is impossible, because there's rhythm, there's other people playing, there's thinking about what you just did, there's thinking about dynamics. Are we getting louder? Are we getting softer? Are we, like there's just so many different things to think about. And it's kind of like I had this image of like running around like tending, like a mad scientist, like tending, boiling beakers all over the lab and spilling stuff. And, and that's kind of like, I mean, at its worst, that's kind of what music playing is like. Or maybe you're like a master chef, like, and you know exactly when to flip each pan, and, and it's just smooth and easy. And, but there is so much to pay attention to. But that's kind of the benefit of, again, this mindfulness, also giving rise to this awareness, because we can move our attention from one thing to the other. And I think, when you've been playing for a little while, you start to recognize that like you can kind of put your attention on this and then put it over here. And the first thing you had your attention on will kind of still take care of itself, for a little while. We have to check back, but there's a lot of jumping around that has to happen. And there's also just a lot of open awareness, which comes down to that idea of like the best, most fun people to play with are the ones who are really listening. Like if people are listening almost more than they're playing, but still they're playing brilliantly, so how does that work?
Yeah. I've heard some folks talk about this kind of thing before, and I think they're generally people like Victor Wooten comes to mind. I'm sure you're a Victor Wooten fan. I forgot to mention that Adam is a bass player. Yeah, he knows Victor Wooten. He's talked about some of these kind of things before in terms of like that spontaneity in the moment. You know what I mean? And kind of like practicing so many things. Like you were talking about, you can put your attention on one thing and then let it go for a minute and like keep checking back in, like your sense of time. If you practice with a metronome for years, you can kind of just let that one sink to the back of the mind, right? So that you can like focus on other things in the moment. So I don't know, that just really resonates with me, what you said right there. And I think is probably confirmed by some of the masters that we love listening to, right? Even if they don't practice Buddhist meditation, right?
Yeah, and there's a flow, like there's a flow that comes with that, being able to kind of slide wherever your attention needs to go, and you can actually put it where it needs to be without destroying all the other things in your universe of things you're tending, while you're playing music. And that kind of highlights what the issue is, what we're trying to watch out for when we're being mindful and cultivating this mindfulness and awareness, which is the getting hooked by something, getting stuck,
Yes.
getting stuck longer than we should be with something, or getting stuck on something that we shouldn't be getting stuck on. But in any case, like we're no longer going with the whole experience. We've gotten fixated on something, and we're stuck there, and then everything else suffers because of that. Whether it's thinking about how we think we sound, or I would get in these situations when I was playing a lot where like I would get hypercritical of the people I was playing with, which is like, it's not cool, and it's also not going to make the best music when you're involved in that in the moment.
I totally hear that. And I've been there in that space too, where it's just not productive, because whether or not you're actively showing the people you're playing with that you're dissatisfied with them in that moment, it affects the vibe of the ensemble or the room, right? Like it's like palpable. You can feel that. So I guess one question that like this thing kind of leads me to is like, we talked about playing through your mistakes and doing these things. So if you do get hooked, like I'm on stage at my gig, Adam, and I've gotten hooked on my bass player's articulation and how it's just like annoying the crap out of me or whatever. You know what I mean? How do I get out of that moment back into the music so that we can like keep the train moving forward,
Yeah. Well, I think that just the general instruction like that I used to give when I was teaching a lot, that training in being able to play through mistakes is so important. And I think I mean, people talk about it, but it doesn't get enough airplay, because really, like, to me, that's just such a fundamental musical skill. And part of it plays into learning how to practice properly, because when you practice, you are isolating. You may be working on a certain bar, or you may be working on your articulation or whatever factor. And when you are practicing, you should know, what are you practicing? And that's something I would ask students frequently, like, what are you practicing when you practice? What is it you're working on? You should know. And then another common thing is, like, I haven't thought about this one in a while, but I remember somebody saying that, like, when you practice, you should sound like crap 75% of the time. Otherwise, you're just jamming, and like, go, Hayes, I want to hear it.
No, I was going to say, you totally said it. This is something that I've never said it that way, but I think the kind of phraseology that I always land on is like, we always gravitate toward the things that we already know well, because we like that sense of gratification when we're practicing, right? But yeah, you're totally right. Like, you need to be, in order to break new ground, you need to be playing stuff that you suck at. That's practice. That is actually what the act of practice is, right? Because I think where a lot of people get confused in music is the playing versus practice. You know what I mean? I think playing like, my practice sessions always start with 5 or 10 minutes of playing and end with maybe 20 minutes of playing, but there's that solid hour or two in there of sucking, of sounding terrible 75% of the time.
Yeah. And so there's two ways that, the playing and the practice, having some idea about what the difference between the two is important. So for instance, if you're working on the notes in a certain section, and you're putting aside some other things like playing it perfectly in rhythm, or playing the right dynamics, if you're really just working on the notes, then you may, stumble and lose your rhythm, but you're working on the notes, and that's okay. And that's one way of playing through a mistake, is realizing, like, I'm working on this thing, not that thing. So it's okay. I don't need to worry about that. I can just focus on this. But that's like a practice thing. That's not going to be, you can't do that on stage, And so you also need to keep in mind things like the fact that I used to use like a train analogy. Like, if you fall off a train, you're not going to be able to hop right back on at that same car, because if the train's moving, it's down the tracks a little bit, you're going to be getting on at a car that's a little further back, and that seems like a simple thing, but when you're practicing music, being able to fumble, maybe even stop playing for a second or two and come back in where you should be is so essential, and it's a learnable skill, and so that's how you would have to do it on stage. Like, that's playing through your mistakes on stage. One form of it is, like, if you do kind of stumble, coming back in where you should be. You can't just start where you were, because no one else is there at that point. So that's one way of looking at it in terms of practice and playing. But another thing is that, like, as you hone your skills of awareness and your skills of like noticing when you have become hooked, this idea of like you're either like you've made a mistake and you're thinking about it, so you can't move on, or something like that. That skill gets better, and it happens sooner and sooner, before or after the mistake itself. Like if you think of the mistake as like a moment in time, like sometimes I think we mentioned this earlier too, like you can see it coming, and you may actually sort of make a pre-mistake and catch it in advance, and then that can get you hooked too. So I think a lot of times, like, I think the broad message here, and this is where it leads into the authentic voice kind of thing too, is that like, we're gonna see all of our own flaws, and that's always the case in life in general, not just music. And that's okay, and like we have to in some way make friends with that. And in fact, we can even start to realize that like maybe that's our personality, maybe that's our stamp on our art. That's our riches, like that's what we have to offer the world, is like these little imperfections that actually like make it glisten and beautiful. So many of our favorite musicians I think we can think of are great examples of that.
Of course. Well, you and I were talking about John Hartford the other day, and I feel like Hartford is the epitome of what you just described there. If you think about the mentality that went into the the Aeroplane record, right? With the song Steam Powered Aeroplane. Like, it was like, let's take a million takes. Some of them are going to have mistakes in them, but we're going to choose the best one that had the right vibe, and that's it, right? Because it's like rough around the edges, and that is the beautiful thing to me about that album, right? But when it comes to self-evaluation, I think that's where we can recognize that in others, but maybe not so much in ourselves a lot of the time, right?
Yeah. And another example is, one thing I was thinking about that if you're a music reader, one of the things we had to do in the 3-year retreat is read Tibetan. So like all of our texts were in Tibetan. So I had to get some faculty in just being able to read it, like not necessarily comprehension, but being able to chant it from the Tibetan characters, which are different from English Arabic characters. So one thing I noticed that when I was starting to learn that is I realized, because that's the chant and it's in rhythm, so there's some musical aspects to it. And I realized that like when I was reading music, and when I was reading English in books, you're never actually looking at what you're saying or playing, usually. Like ideally, you're a little bit ahead. Like your eyes are a little bit in front of what you're doing. And I think the reason for that is because if you're reading a little bit ahead of where you are, first of all, our brains are amazing, right? And so we don't have to be looking at what we're playing. We can see it and play it a little bit later and still be in time. I don't know how that works, but that's the truth. So, but if you make a mistake, if you're reading along and you make a little mistake in your reading before you're actually playing it, there's a little gap there where you can fix it before it's actually happening with your instrument. There's something went wrong in your head with your reading, and you catch it before it actually comes out of your instrument. And we do that with our reading in books too. Like we're rarely actually processing what our eyes are on. And so there's a great life analogy there too. If we're thinking a little bit ahead of where we are, it's a lot easier to catch where we might go wrong.
Yeah, so I guess this kind of brings us back to that question that I had earlier, like where on the bubble do we kind of focus, right? So it's like, if this is now, then maybe like there is the best place. You know what I mean? Like just an inch ahead or something like that. Yeah, that's really interesting to me. I would love to talk to a neurologist about this stuff, to see what because you were talking about how does that work in the human mind, but we know when it's not working, right? But we don't know why it's not working and all that stuff.
And it's worth stating. I mean, I think a lot of musicians know this, but I did look this up the other day because I figured I would mention this today. But it's amazing the amount of activity that's happening in our minds when we're playing music. I mean, it's kind of unprecedented in terms of things you can do and how much of your brain is firing. Like we're using all parts of our brain when we're engaged in making music. And there's not a lot of professions that do that, or a lot of activities that do that. We're doing so much, and it's such a triumph of evolution that we're able to make all this stuff happen.
Agreed. I mean, and it's funny because I think there has been like there's been survey research for decades that has like supported this, but we're just now getting into the part, like you said, where like there is actual like hard analytical data on the brain itself that showcases this, right? Because I mean, how many times has anyone out there ever heard, that kids that take music lessons when they're young do better at like math and science in school and all of these other things, right? Like these people who learn a musical craft or an art of some kind that's similar live longer. All these kinds of things are correlated with one another, and I like you said, it's unprecedented. I think that's all connected, right? Like it's using the whole mind when we're doing this. Probably everything that you were talking about earlier. I'm having my own revelations right now. It's like we are forced to reckon with past, present, and future in the act of doing this art. Like how many other activities are there? You said reading, right? Like reading is one of these things that can like do it, but how many activities out there actually make you reckon with all of that in the same moment,
Yeah, and I think another way to say that is like thinking in terms of mindfulness and how it also is cultivated with awareness, and mindfulness being the point, like the exact spot we're paying attention to, and awareness being just the whole environment of it. We can think about music the same way. Like I remember having this realization that like music was so amazing because you can't have it in a finger snap. Like you can't just absorb a song in a second, like, and so a second of a song is not the song, but it's a part of the song, and the whole of the song is not that second, like it's a temporal art, it's like it's literally painting time, and you can only experience it in the passage of in a process, in the passage of time. Like that's different from a painting, it's different from a sculpture. I mean, you can make the argument you have to kind of walk around a sculpture and there's different areas of the picture to look at, but time is what we're, that's what we're painting in a way with our music, and that's fascinating.
Yeah, I need to sit with that one for.
But so yeah, so I feel like I made a just to put a bow on that. I think so. What I'm kind of saying is that like the mindfulness part sort of is where we are in the moment, but it's meaningless without the whole. It only comes into focus when we have the whole there too, and so both of them are dependent on each other.
Yeah, I love that. It's you can't have one without the other. That's totally true.
Yeah.
I think that's why we've all been depressed these last 2 years, because we haven't been able to experience live music and stuff like that, right? Like if you're used to kind of, I know that's a kind of a bit of a tangent, but it just makes me think about, if you're used to experiencing that and it's removed from your life, then that's a big deal,
Oh yeah. And I mean that really hit me when I got back to my first Fish concert this summer, because I'm a huge fan of the band Fish, and it'd been, I'd seen a lot of shows, and I took my longest break when I was in that retreat, for basically 4 years of not seeing them, and then the pandemic, and so I saw them this summer. Actually, 5 years that would have been, but I forgot like what it sounded like to hear music in an open space, where it travels through the air, and there's like, I mean, that's just a whole different thing to get that sonic environment, and be within that environment.
Well, I had there was a great musician that I used to play with when I lived up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. His name is Bruce Ling. Shout out to Bruce if you're out there, man. But he always talked about the power of playing live music with one another, because you're literally like moving waves through each other. You're like taking something that you've generated and putting it like through another human being. That, like sound moves through people. So that's a very, I know that once again, that's a bit of a tangent or like kind of a different angle on this thing, but it's powerful. It's extremely powerful in that way. And that I actually want to take this moment to kind of stop and talk about Fish specifically too. This is a little plug for Adam, because I know he's not going to give it himself because he's a humble guy. But there is a podcast of your own that you kind of have in the works right now. Our future listeners listening to this will already be subscribers to this podcast because it's going to be the hottest one on Spotify, right? But give us the rundown of what you're working on with Fish, because it's kind of tied to our conversation here today a little bit, right?
Yeah. So the podcast will be called Lama to Boot. That's one Lama, and then to boot is TABOOT, and we will be on Twitter and Instagram with that same name. But when I did my retreat obviously that's kind of a rare thing to do in the West for people to kind of get locked in a house and isolated for 3.5 years to practice. And so there's a men's and a women's house, and I was in the house with 11 other guys, and one of the guys happened to be another big Fish fan. So auspicious circumstances arise, and so we found that out, and we ended up spending a lot of time, like that was sort of our connection, and remembering, shows that we'd seen or historic dates of like really great shows. I had a pair of socks that matched the dress that the drummer wears. It's a blue dress with red donuts, and I would wear those on like historic days as like a nod. But anyway, he and I are both lamas now, and we have always kind of talked about meditation and Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, in terms of like fish, and we've talked about fish in terms of Dharma. And it's not to say that one is the other at all, but there is a sort of truth that you can learn through any experience in the human realm, like I think, but in particular for us, fish was something we connected with. Their improvisation, the community, the sense of just being open to totally new things all the time, and cultivating that in their fans, like going to shows and not having any idea about what song you're going to hear. They just did a Halloween show where they played 3 sets, and the middle set was like 95 minutes long, and it was 12 brand new songs that no one had ever heard before. And that's like the kind of thing they do. And it's a historic, awesome night. Like most bands, if you go and they play nothing, that's like a bummer and you want your money back. But like Fish like taught us to like be okay with this groundlessness and embrace it amongst many, many, many other things. And so I feel like there was something we learned, and we always felt that way. And there's a similar truth, that Buddhism teaches and that meditation can teach. And not even just that. I mean, and you can learn what I'm saying is that there is like some kind of ways of finding happiness and avoiding suffering that exist. And then there's lots of ways of finding your way there. So this podcast will be us talking about these concepts, these Buddhist concepts of karma and mindfulness and compassion and all these different ideas, retreat, and then relating them to something with the band Fish, So like we talked about mindfulness, and we talked about this concept of getting attached, non-attachment. And we talked about set lists and not, playing the same songs and not knowing what you're going to hear. And then we talked another time about like a retreat. We're going to talk about the festivals Fish would put on, which are like multi-day festivals where you're just immersed in this culture, So we'll be kind of tying these two things together and hopefully making some new fans from one direction and the other. So maybe someone's into Fish and they'll get turned on to that stuff.
Just thinking that in my mind, like I love that Venn diagram, like Buddhism and Fish, just the overlap right there. Like there are about to be a lot more Buddhist Fish fans out there, right? I love this.
Yeah. Well, one choice we made, just so people know, is that we are playing no music on the podcast. And the reason for that is that you can do the research on your own, and we wouldn't want anyone to tune in and then be like, oh, I hate this, and turn it off and not listen anymore. So you can listen and hate Fish. That's fine too. I'll just throw that out there.
Yeah. Well, I love that, because that almost leaves it open to kind of like finding, even if, say someone listening isn't a Fish fan, but they are a fan of another band, they could maybe see the kind of connection between the concepts, that like you're presenting from the Buddhist perspective and their band, insert band name here, not just Fish, right?
Yes.
That's really cool. Well, we're 36 minutes in, so I wanna steer the conversation maybe back toward our kind of original points and tie a kind of a button or a ribbon on that rather. If there is one thing, because we love doing practical stuff here at Mandolin Secrets Live. We have real musicians listening to this, real people who are in the trenches actually trying to learn these things. If there's one thing that people can do today or moving forward from listening to this podcast to kind of play through their mistakes, stay in the moment, and do that kind of stuff, what would you suggest? Like, what's the first step that someone could take right now?
Well, a lot of times the issue is that we're thinking about what we're doing rather than just doing it. So and that's in a way that's one of those things that's kind of like saying nothing, but also saying everything at the same time. But one way to think about it in terms of our topic, our overarching topic of playing through mistakes today is like, we don't have to be evaluative of what we're doing. We don't have to be evaluating while we're doing it all the time. And that's, I think, a really good place to start. Like, we can know what we're doing and be making sure that we're doing that and noticing when we're not and coming back to doing what we should be doing without also evaluating. Like, those two processes don't necessarily have to go together. Another word for evaluate would maybe be judge.
Yeah.
So yes, we're going to catch mistakes and we can come back, and we don't have to judge that, because judging means starting to tell a story. Judging means starting to like spin a narrative. And that takes a lot of headspace, and that definitely is like a good sign that we've gotten hooked somehow or another. So this is a thing we can do while we're playing. Like, that's the practical playing aspect. But the thing about mindfulness and awareness is that it is going to work the best when we're cultivating it all day long. So this is a thing that we should be watching for all the time. If we want to go out for a walk because it's a beautiful night, enjoy the walk. We don't have to think about what we're going to be doing when we get home, or even comparing like, oh, last night's sunrise was a little nicer than tonight. No, just enjoy the sunrise, and there's practices, mindfulness practices help with that, because we are so prone to getting hooked. We are so prone to telling these stories. We're prone to judging. That's our habit, so we do need to start to undo these habits, but every little bit of undoing helps, so even just catching for a second, that you are starting to think about what you're doing rather than doing it, is a good way to interrupt that momentum of getting hooked, and yeah.
That's the one thing that I really took away from your talk a couple weeks ago for KTC was the kind of mindful work day thing. It's like when you notice, when that awareness comes, right? Like taking a breath and just sinking back into the body and letting that wash over you. You know what I mean? Like it's almost like a mini meditation in that moment, right? Or something like that.
Yeah, definitely.
That's great, Adam. Well, thanks so much for joining us here today. Before we get out of here, I want to say that Adam does have an online presence aside from the podcast here. So definitely give us the handles for the podcast one more time so people can check that out if they're listening in the future.
Yeah, so it's Lama, 1L. There's an old saying, 1L is a priest, 2 L's is a beast. So this is the 1L, Lama. And then the second word is taboot, Taboot, which is a reference to a fish song. Nice. And then and I also have the website, lamaadam.com.
Yeah, so there's
also 1L.
I've got Lama Taboot on the screen here, and then there's lamaadam.com. Putting these up on the screen for all of our Facebook viewers. And also, I'm going to say this because I know that Adam won't. Adam also has a Buy Me a Coffee page that is located at the bottom of the screen here. It's buymeacoffee.com/Lama Adam, LAMAADAM. So if you enjoyed the talk here today, then show him some support by buying him a meal or paying for his internet next month or something like that. That's a pretty cool thing to do. So I guess to close things up, thanks so much, Adam, for joining us here today. I look forward to having you back on the podcast in the future because something tells me this is just the beginning of our mindfulness journey together here, my friend. What do you think?
Yeah, sounds great. I really appreciate you having me, and I love the conversation. So love to do it again anytime.
Yeah, no problem, my friend. All right, music makers, that about wraps it up for this episode of Mandolin Secrets Live. We're kind of in flux a little bit here on the show. Magnus and I have been busy teaching a live 6-week online course, but we're going to be coming back at you toward the end of this year and in the new year with our regular bi-weekly schedule. So to kind of keep up with us, head to mandolinsecrets.com/live for information on how to keep up with the show. And you can always find us on your favorite podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the stuff. I think that's about it for today. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next show. Until then, stay inspired and be a music maker.